The wind that night carried the sound of something older than the prairie itself, something like a prayer shivering through the cottonwoods, and I remember thinking the winter had finally learned to speak. Long before I saw her shadow, I felt the cold tremble of a life nearly spent, and curiosity pressed against my ribs as I wondered what creature of frost dared wander so far from shelter. When she finally staggered into the lantern glow of Colt Remington's cabin porch, Mara Snowbird, age 20, wrapped in nothing but a torn blanket and stubborn breath, she looked like winter had carved her from the storm itself. Colt Remington, age 30, paused in the act of bolting his door, for he had been a man who locked away more than the world knew, and yet something in her eyes broke whatever resolve he had left, leaving him wondering why such fragility had found him on a night when mercy felt expensive. "I'll freeze in this cold, please let me come inside," she whispered, the words trembling as though each one might shatter before reaching him, and the plea cut deeper than the wind ever could. Colt hesitated only long enough for his shame to flare. He knew what the town would say if they learned he'd taken in a native woman, but the fear in her stance made the decision for him. He stepped aside, letting her slip into the thin warmth of his cabin, his heart stumbling with a strange, rising ache that felt too much like purpose. He watched her sink near the fire, fingers splaying toward the flame as though reacquainting herself with life, and he wondered what storm had abandoned her at his threshold tonight. By morning, the sun rose pale and uncertain, as though it feared the cold it tried to outrun. Colt saddled his horse for town, his mind uneasy as he left Mara resting beneath a mountain of blankets. The path to Dead Elm Crossing felt longer than usual, each hoofbeat echoing the town's likely scorn. And indeed, the moment he stepped into Crowder's store, Maybelle herself was waiting with a gaze sharp enough to split bone. "We heard you're shelterin' one of them," she hissed, tossing a sack of flour onto the counter as though performing judgment. Colt forced stillness into his breath, though shame curled in him like smoke, making him wonder if kindness was ever free out here. Yet even as the whispers clawed at his ears, the memory of Mara's half-blue lips returned, reminding him that leaving her outside would have been a sin he'd never forget. He returned home with hands full of supplies and a heart full of doubt, pushing open the cabin door to find Mara standing at the window, still and silent, as though she feared he might bring back a verdict instead of food. The fire painted soft gold along her hair, revealing faint bruises along her jaw, marks that raised questions he wasn't sure he deserved to ask. Mara met his eyes with a timid steadiness, and he felt something shift in the air, as though the fragile trust between them had taken its first breath. She asked if he needed help cooking, voice delicate as thawing ice, and he wondered what life had taught her to speak with such careful restraint. That night, as the snow hissed against the window, Mara spoke in fragments, her memories falling like shattered beads from a broken necklace. She told him how her tribe had exiled her, believing she had betrayed them by aiding a rival clan, though she insisted she had only tried to stop bloodshed. Her voice wavered, yet her pride held firm, revealing a girl born of storms and sorrow. Colt listened in silence, feeling her pain settle inside him like an old, familiar ache. Every few sentences, she paused, watching the fire as though expecting it to judge her too, and he found himself leaning closer, curious about what truths still trembled beneath her unspoken words. When she finished, she looked at him with a fear too old for her young face, asking softly if he regretted letting her in. Colt answered not with words but with small gestures. He placed another log on the fire, poured her a fresh cup of warm broth, and draped his own coat across her shoulders. In return, Mara began stitching the torn sleeve of his winter coat, her hands gentle, her focus intense, as though mending fabric was easier than mending her life. Their days fell into a quiet rhythm, sharing tasks, sharing silence, sharing glances that lingered just a touch too long. Each gesture painted a new thread of connection between them, a bond woven slowly and without intention, like two lonely travelers finding warmth by accident. One dusk, as she handed him a tin cup, their fingers brushed and lingered, and both drew back with a startled breath, uncertain of the moment they had almost stepped into. Yet peace in the West was a fragile thing, and whispers traveled faster than truth. Sheriff Abner Holt arrived one afternoon, his silhouette casting a stern shadow across the cabin threshold. He spoke of town concerns, of people unhappy that Colt was harboring a tribal girl, of fears that trouble would follow. Colt stood with arms rigid at his sides, every word from the sheriff stirring a storm inside him he didn't know how to quiet. When the sheriff rode away, the dust of judgment lingering behind him, Colt felt a weight settle across his shoulders, the same weight Mara must have carried her whole life. And when he stepped back inside, heart heavy, he found her quietly packing the few belongings she had, as though she had expected this outcome from the moment she arrived. She told him she would not be the cause of his ruin, that she had survived cold before and could survive it again. Her voice trembled not from fear but from resignation, the kind of surrender born from a lifetime of being unwanted. Colt moved quickly, blocking the door with a desperation he didn't know he was capable of. "You come inside my life," he whispered. "Don't you dare walk back into the cold." He took her hands in his own, pressing them against his chest where his heartbeat stuttered in unspoken confession, and he wondered how a stranger had become the most precious thing he'd nearly lost. When dawn came, soft and uncertain, he saddled his horse with the knowledge that they could no longer hide, for their story demanded daylight. They rode into town side by side, the silence between them full of fragile courage. As they approached the small wooden chapel, people gathered, their eyes sharp with scorn. Maybelle called Colt a fool, others muttered about betrayal of blood, but Colt kept walking, carrying a loyalty that felt heavier and holier than anything he had held before. Inside the chapel, the minister hesitated only a breath before beginning the ceremony, two souls bruised by the world choosing each other despite its cruelty. Their vows were soft, spoken like promises carved in snow, vulnerable, fleeting, beautiful. When the final blessing fell over them, Mara's eyes shimmered with something freer than hope, and Colt felt a warmth bloom where cold had lived for years. Outside, snowflakes drifted down again, covering the tracks of those who had doubted them, and he wondered what kind of life they could build now that they had chosen each other so fiercely. Their married life grew like spring out of winter, slow, tender, and full of small miracles. Mara filled the cabin with soft humming, songs from her childhood that danced in the air like ember sparks. Colt taught her to ride his gentlest horse, and her laughter, bright and surprised, echoed through the valley like bird call returning after long silence. She braided leather straps for his saddle. He helped her plant herbs outside the cabin once the thaw came, and they worked side by side as though they had always been two halves of the same quiet dream. Their first kiss arrived not with urgency but with gratitude, his hands cupping her jaw as though afraid she'd break, her lips warm with the promise of belonging. For the first time since childhood, Colt believed the world might hold soft places, and he wondered how many more dreams could bloom from the simple act of loving her. But the West never forgot its storms. One evening, as dusk spilled burnt gold across the prairie, distant drums echoed across the hills, solemn, rhythmic, heavy with memory. Mara froze, hands stilling over a pot of stew, her breath catching as shadows approached the cabin. A small group from her tribe stepped forward, faces carved with anger and relief all tangled together. They announced that the truth of her innocence had finally surfaced, that she could return and reclaim her place among them. But their eyes hardened when they saw Colt, their disdain sharp as flint. They said she didn't belong in a white man's world, that he wasn't worthy of her shadow, much less her life. Mara's heart teetered on a fragile edge, torn between the roots of her past and the fragile home she had built with Colt, and he wondered if love alone was enough to anchor her here. Colt didn't beg. He didn't argue. He simply stepped aside, though the movement tore something open inside him. "I won't hold you prisoner," he murmured, voice cracking like thin ice, "but don't think it won't break me." Mara looked at her tribe, then at Colt, the only man who had offered her warmth when the world was colder than death. Snow began falling again, soft and directionless, and she stepped forward as though stepping into two possible lifetimes. For a moment the world held its breath. Then Mara whispered, "My home is with the man who opened his door when all others closed theirs, and turned her back on the path that had already taken too much from her." Her tribe left in bitter silence, the snow swallowing their footprints once more, and Colt gathered her into his arms with a tenderness that felt like salvation, wondering what futures could rise from a love chosen twice. That night, firelight cast gentle shadows along the cabin walls as they sat wrapped together beneath a woven blanket, the storm easing into steady peace. Mara rested her head against Colt's chest, listening to the heartbeat she had once feared she'd never hear again. She took his hand and placed it gently against her stomach, whispering that a new life stirred there, fragile, small, full of promise. Colt closed his eyes, overwhelmed by a warmth that spilled through every hollow space he'd carried for years, and he wondered what kind of world they could build for their child, one carved from gentleness instead of judgment. And now, as an old soul remembering the tale, I tell you this. Sometimes love begins with a door opened not out of courage but out of instinct, the kind born when the heart recognizes what the mind cannot name. The world will always have its whispers, its cold winds, its sharp eyes searching for reasons to divide. But the quiet moments, the shared cup, the stitched coat, the hand offered in winter, these are the things that shape a life worth living. So if the night ever brings a knock to your door, I hope you let courage guide your hand to the latch, for you never know what frozen soul might be waiting to thaw beside your fire, and what future might be born from the simple act of letting them in.